Dr. Thomas Hemingway here. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out. All right. Welcome. Good to be back. Oh my gosh, guys. Hope you're doing well. It was so great to be down visiting my mom, and so grateful she's doing a little better. And it's been an interesting ride. This whole thing about cancer and being in the family, and when you're a medical doctor, it's it's pretty interesting because you kind of know a lot more than you want to know sometimes about health, about wellness, about disease, all these kinds of things. Well, anyway. We've learned a lot, and it's been quite a ride, and it's ongoing, but we're just cherishing and valuing each and every day. And that's just been the beauty. That's been the game changer for us, is just remembering that each day is a gift. So I hope you and yours and all of those that mean something to you, that you'll remember each day just to say you love them, that you care about them, that you're thinking about them, because I think it's just way too easy to take things for granted, because we just don't know when things might be different, when things could be coming to a close. It happens way quicker than any of us would want. And being a physician now for over 20 years, having witnessed every portion of the life cycle from birth until death, and there's so many miraculous things along the way, including just the very birth of a new little one. It's just remarkable. And then sometimes we see it cut short. And so just cherish every day. Every day is a gift. Every breath is a gift. And I got to, just think about that a little bit more this weekend with my mom and being with her, because, her days are numbered. And, for now we're feeling pumped and grateful because she's feeling a little bit better. So thanks to all you guys who have been praying and thinking and sending good vibes. I appreciate that, and it means a lot. So this week I wanted to podcast about something that a lot of people have had questions about, and it's something that we're not always getting the best information by the powers that be, right? There's just too many things out there that send us information that are not always amazing, whether it be the USDA food pyramid or the nutrition facts labels, things like that. They're not always correct with what we should or what we shouldn't be eating. And so we'll get into that in this podcast. And I think it'll provide you with not only a few surprises along the way, but a lot of value. And one thing that's full of value, I hope some of you guys have joined in and heard about, is my new Thrive community. It's just one of these things that gets me pumped. It gets me smiling, gets me grateful. I just did a training this weekend on how to incorporate the power of protein into your life. I did a Zoom call recently in the Thrive group, and then I did an additional training this weekend because I just feel like protein is so critical. It's so key. And a lot of us are missing the boat here because we're focusing on the quote unquote healthy whole grains or something else. And we're missing out on the power of protein, which is essential. So I hope you guys will jump on into the Thrive community. Check out the link here in the show notes or in the description or on YouTube. There'll be a couple of links there. It's just a community of goodness, of wellness, of information and action steps. We never leave a podcast, a training, or anything without action steps. And so this is a great community where you'll be supported by many like-minded people. I get in there every day. I answer questions in our threads. I put on new trainings every week. We do live Zoom calls as well. It's just a beautiful place to share and grow and thrive, because life is not just about living and surviving, but thriving, living your best, your healthiest, your most energetic, vital, and then having that to give back to your family, your friends, your loved ones, your community. Because if you're not thriving in your life, it is so hard to give and to help and to reach out if you're not doing well. So join me and let's thrive together. So without further ado, I wanted to get into the topic of the week, which is bread. All about the bread and the grains and what the heck is this gluten thing? And is bread good for you? Is it bad for you? I mean, literally for thousands and thousands of years, we've been consuming bread of some type, right? In the Holy Book, it says bread is the staff of life. Well, that bread was not like most of the breads that we are eating nowadays. In fact, bread changed a lot just 100 and 200 years ago when we started to pulverize the wheat, and it began to resemble something very different from the ancient grains and from the classic, stone ground wheat and grains that were out there. We started to not only pulverize it into super small, readily absorbable particles, which can rapidly spike glucose. In fact, I've talked many times about this thing called the glycemic index, which describes how quickly carbohydrates, or really sugars, will ultimately spike our blood sugar and get absorbed. And something with a high glycemic index, which is really anything over 60 or 65 or so, will spike our blood sugars. And the glycemic index of like white bread, like shout out to all you guys who grew up like I did with the Wonder Bread and the Wonder Bread trucks. I don't even know if they exist anymore, but literally we had PB&Js on that ridiculously sweet, tasty Wonder Bread, which was a dessert, if anything, that has the glycemic index of nearly 100, which is actually higher than table sugar. So it's ridiculous. The quote-unquote healthy whole grains may not be so healthy overall. One of the reasons is because of this huge, dramatic, quick spike in your blood sugar, which, as we've talked about previously, every time we're spiking our blood sugar, we're correspondingly spiking our insulin. And what this does is cause us not only to get fat, but to be inflamed. Inflammation is the result of this constant spiking of glucose and insulin, this process called glycation, right? We've talked about hemoglobin A1C or HbA1c, which is measured not only in diabetics, but hopefully you've all had this measured to kind of see where you're at with respect to this glycation, which is kind of like the biologic rust that can occur in our bodies secondary to having glucose spiking all the time. And one of the ways that this can spike is with highly refined and processed carbohydrates like the grains and flours, like the so-called healthy whole grains that are included in this super finely granulated, ground up form in breads, which literally can spike your blood sugar more than even table sugar. And that's like this white bread that's been pulverized to just this tiny, tiny, finely ground, which gives it lots of surface area so it'll be rapidly absorbed, rapidly spike this blood sugar or your glucose, and then insulin, which is not a good thing, causing the so-called biologic rust or glycation that can occur in our body. And the other difference is nowadays, I thought this was super, super interesting, is the wheat that we commonly use is called this dwarf, this smaller wheat. And when it was first discovered in about the 1950s or so by a scientist by the name of Norman Borlaug, it was literally a game-changing thing for the worldwide hunger situation because it made wheat more resistant to many things, including pesticides, to diseases out there, to drought. It made it especially drought resistant. This dwarf wheat, or so-called semi-dwarf wheat, was able to be grown in much more arid climates, which with less water, even grown with pesticides, and it would thrive. And there's so many qualities which made it super great for just production purposes. We could produce more wheat per square acre of ground and per less nutrients, but it was not awesome to our health, right? We know that 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, starvation was a huge issue. Now we are literally starving in a sea of plenty. In other words, nowadays the WHO classifies obesity and all of its complications, right, including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, even cancers and things that are resulting from this overfed, undernourished state, this obesity crisis that is affecting nearly every country worldwide. So interestingly enough, this wheat, like I mentioned, was developed in about the 1950s or so by this gentleman named Norman Borlaug. And it was super interesting because they went from having a really high, stock wheat to shorter. That's why they call it dwarf wheat, which was more resistant to not only the drier climates and pesticides and less nutrients, but it also, didn't blow around as much in the wind, for example. It wasn't tall and wavy. And so when you have the original type of wheat that was much taller, would wave around in the wind, it would get heavier and it could just fall over. And once the wheat touched the ground, then it would become less usable. And so with this newer plant, this sort of dwarf wheat, it was shorter, it had a stronger stalk, it didn't fall over in the wind. It also took much less time for it to grow, and it didn't need to get to these taller heights before it could be harvested. And so this shorter stalk was also more easily harvested by these big giant combines and machinery, which made, of course, the harvest less intensive. And so this wheat was literally a game changer at its origin for world hunger, but we didn't know at that time these many, numerous, and sundry health issues that would come of it. And so although it was quite a marvel of modern science and technology, in fact, this gentleman, Dr. Borlaug, he won the Nobel Prize for developing this dwarf wheat. It has literally led to significant health problems because of its issues with not only the pesticide-laden composition, which most of these wheats are sprayed with. In fact, I think about 80% was the statistic that I was researching of the wheat worldwide is laden with pesticides. They either do it in the beginning or they may just do it at the end because the pesticides like Roundup kind of desiccate or dry out the plant. But these wheat, the little wheat at the end of the stalk there was so resistant to the drying effects of the pesticide that it would survive just fine, right? They're drought resistant, they were pesticide resistant, and so they could literally spray the wheat at harvest time to basically make the plant itself kind of shrivel up, and it would make the harvesting with the combines and such so much easier because the rest of the stalk and stem would sort of disintegrate away, and what would be left is the little tiny wheat there on the end of these dwarf stems because they were resistant to this drying out process, which was basically done with a pesticide like Roundup or other glyphosate sprayed at the very end close to harvest. So not only do some of them get sprayed early on to get rid of the weeds, but they get sprayed close to harvest just to help with the desiccation, the drying out process, and the harvesting, which is crazy because none of us want to be eating pesticides, right? Pesticides are not good for us, and they're not good for our little guys called the microbiome, or I should say microbiota, that live in us, within us, on us. These pesticides not only kill them and change the gut flora, but they can harm us as well in so many different ways. And one of the biggest ones is by harming our gut health, because literally pesticides are kind of like antibiotics for the gut organisms and for also the plants that are growing in the field. They're kind of like antibiotics for them. So they are depriving them of the sheer nutrients that they need. They're killing off a lot of the good ones, and the ones that are thriving are those not so good ones. So it's really quite a concept of this dwarf wheat, which originally was, lauded and just given all the props, right? It won literally a Nobel Prize in the 1950s and 60s because it was such a genetic, discovery. But they didn't know the downstream effects, like the problems with the pesticides, the problems with the fact that this is a totally different wheat that's been pulverized into these tiny little flour particles that most of the breads that are out there are composed of. And so it's not like the wheat that we used to have thousands of years ago, right? The only potential, we should say, manufacturing process, they would grind it against stone mills. So the so-called stone ground wheat of yesteryear is not quite what's happening in the majority of factories today, where it's completely pulverized. And when it's pulverized, it not only causes more surface area to be available for absorption, which spikes the blood sugar, but it also gets rid of all of the potentially healthy parts of the wheat, right? The fibrous capsule, the so-called endosperm, the stuff. We as humans thrive when we have fiber in our diets, because we're feeding all of those good guys, our partners, so to speak, our partners in the gut. The microbiota thrive off fiber. And when you're pulverizing it, you're essentially getting rid of all the fiber. And also, as I mentioned, the dwarf wheat, not only is it smaller in the stem, but it's shorter in the roots as well. And so when it's shorter in the roots, it's less likely to be able to absorb the nutrients from the soil. And so it's a much less nutritious form of wheat than our ancestors used to eat. So it's very different. It's very much more processed, very much more pulverized. It has very much more pesticides. And so most of the breads out there are made up of this finely ground processed flour. In fact, in the US alone, we eat on average 133 pounds of flour a year, 133 pounds, another 120 pounds of sugar. So that's almost 300 pounds of highly processed sugars and grains and flours. And it's ridiculous. I mean, these are not good for our health. That may be one of the biggest factors in our obesity epidemic, is our high consumption of the finely pulverized ground flours and sugars, which we are consuming at much too high of a rate. And so, sorry, the healthy whole grains out there are mostly not that healthy. And it's because of these issues, right? There's less nutrients in them than there used to be because of the shorter stems, the shorter roots. Also, our soils are much more depleted when we're spraying the soils with pesticides. That's an issue, as well as our monocropping and tilling techniques, where we're getting rid of all these nutrients which should be there and replacing them with not so awesome things, right? Artificial fertilizers, of course, artificial pesticides and things like that. Really interesting. There was a doctor by the name of Weston Price who he actually loved to study ancient cultures. And he did study a couple who had a lot of wheat in their diet. And they were different. They used a different type of wheat. And they ground it only with really sort of ancient techniques like stones. And they weren't pulverizing it. And they also would ferment it for a long period of time. So they actually didn't have a lot of these dangerous effects of the highly pulverized and processed wheat that we get nowadays, because they ground it with just stones. They would ferment it for 12 to 24 hours. Nowadays, we have this rapid, I won't mention any names because you guys are all familiar with them. And this is not to hate on them, but we have these rapid rising yeasts that we buy at the store and that are used in manufacturing, where you can literally get your dough to rise in 1 hour, as opposed to 12 or 24 hours, which was how they did it in the old days. And it was much better because in the fermentation process, as the wheat is exposed to these natural yeast starters that have literally been used for decades, sometimes hundreds of years, these starter yeasts, it will take 12 to 24 hours for the dough to rise. And in this process, you have fermentation. Fermentation is amazing for several reasons. One, because it makes nutrients more available. Also, the fermentation process can get rid of the so-called anti-nutrients, because in wheat, you often have what's called phytic acid, which is an anti-nutrient, which makes nutrients harder to be absorbed. You may remember we had about 150 years ago or so, we had this big issue. We were starting to mass produce, finely ground flours and grains to be able to make breads with and things. And we had this huge epidemic of Pellagra, which is a vitamin B deficiency. And we were kind of confused because people were getting better fed than they used to be, but they didn't have the nutrients in the wheat and the grains because we were literally growing it in these monocrop techniques. We were pulverizing it, and we didn't have the nutrients that we were used to. And so people were having this major issue called Pellagra, which is a vitamin deficiency, vitamin B primarily. So in the US and in many other countries like Canada, they started to quote unquote enrich, right, the breads with thiamine and the other B vitamins because we were lacking them in the wheat. And so years ago, hundreds, even thousands of years ago, they never did this because they were using kind of the whole wheat, not just this pulverized portion of the internal part, right? They were using the whole grain. And so that has been a big issue over the years. And another issue is just this whole notion of gluten, right? Many of us have a sensitivity to gluten. Gluten has this protein called gliadin, which interestingly enough, in the newer, which is basically everything post 1950s, these dwarf wheats that make up 80 to 90% of all the wheats used in the world, they have a higher percentage of this gliadin protein, which is what causes the gluten issues in many people, this sensitivity, or some that have even more of a reaction that have full-on celiac disease. And so they should be avoiding gluten, especially these highly pulverized wheats and grains like wheat, barley, and rye, which are the primary ones that contain gluten. And so this gliadin protein in this sort of genetically modified environment where we have these dwarf wheats that not only are drought resistant, pesticide resistant, you can grow more of it on a smaller field, you can get way higher production levels, which has basically solved the worldwide hunger issue in the sense that it's made more wheat available in smaller fields and things like that, but it's completely devastated the nutrition issue because there's almost no nutritional value. In fact, many of them are worse in the sense that they're empty calories. You're possibly being suspect to this whole issue of being overfed and undernourished, leading to obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and all of these common ailments of today, which are almost entirely preventable if we were to change up our diet. So this issue of gluten didn't used to be quite the issue because now the wheats have a much higher percentage of this gluten or gliadin protein in them that is even more instrumental in causing this notion of leaky gut. You guys have heard of leaky gut, or maybe some of you have read the book Wheat Belly or Grain Belly, or all these different blogs and books that have been written on gluten and its problems. And what the primary issue is that many people are sensitive to it, and it will cause this protein called zonulin to go up, which loosens sort of the barrier of the intestinal tract. If you think about it, the intestines, they cover a surface area of almost as big as a apartment or a tennis court, depending on what source you read. And so they have just a huge square footage that is literally available to the outside world. And what separates one cell to the next is less than one hair thickness. It's literally so thin, so small, and that can easily open up and form a gap. It's called the gap junction. If that opens up from the zonulin that gets released when we have gluten, then it can cause this issue of leaky gut, which allows not only foreign particles like gluten and other food particles to get into the bloodstream, but it can also allow other microbes like bacteria, viruses, and things to get into the bloodstream. You've heard of endotoxemia, perhaps, which is a result of this. These intestinal microbes, the bacteria that live in us, within us, on us, they can get into the bloodstream if we have leaky gut. And that leaky gut has been shown to be caused by things like gluten that open up these tight junctions and open them up and allow for both food particles and bacteria to enter the blood. This is not awesome because when you have food particles that shouldn't be entering the blood at their size and things, as well as bacteria, this can cause not only potentially endotoxemia from the bacteria, but also lots of allergy issues. And a lot of folks who have conditions like autoimmune disease, a lot of food sensitivities, food allergies will have at their root leaky gut. And so many those tuned in docs, like functional medicine docs that know about this, will say, hey, you should stop all of your gluten consumption for at least a few weeks, hopefully at least a month, and do what they would call an elimination diet, reverse, which often will reverse a lot of these sensitivities, allergies, and even these autoimmune diseases can be reversed or eliminated with one of these diets where they basically eliminate things like gluten, things like dairy, and processed foods. And so I'm not saying that everybody has to do this, but if you have any issues of inflammation in your body, you get achy joints, you get brain fog, you get some common gut ailments, maybe you alternate between constipation and having diarrhea, or you get some crampy abdominal pain, or you're just not as energetic as you would like, or you have skin rashes like eczema, all of these could have at their trigger a gluten sensitivity or some low-grade inflammation. So I would challenge you, try to do a full week, if not 10 days. There's a lot of purported benefit from at least just a 10-day sort of detox diet where you stop all of the processed foods, you stop all of the gluten. And if you can even extend that for a whole month, you'll really know if it's affecting you adversely, wheat or gluten. And so I would encourage you to try it under supervision of your doctor or healthcare provider, because you know what? You can survive without wheat in your diet, without gluten in your diet. You can survive without that. Don't replace it with other crappy things that are highly processed. A lot of folks just immediately turn to corn, and corn is often GMO, it's often pulverized, it's often coupled with seed oils and things like that. And so just because it says gluten-free doesn't mean that it's amazing for you, but it might be something to consider, to go off of all gluten, all wheat for at least a 10-day period, maybe even consider a month. A lot of folks out there have tried this sort of 30-day no bread, no gluten diet, and they've had tremendous benefits. But I've seen benefits in people in as little as 7 days. So it might be something you want to consider, because you don't want to have something like this causing your leaky gut or allergy problems or sensitivities to food or autoimmune disorders such as the bowel ailments, Crohn's, IBD, IBS, all these bowel ailments, leaky gut, which could be caused by something so simple as this product, this protein in wheat or gluten. Because nowadays, like I mentioned, this dwarf wheat has a much higher percentage of the gliadin protein, way higher. It also has this starch called amylopectin A, which is much more likely to cause issues. And so you can avoid that. You can avoid the potential pesticides that most of the wheat products are laden with, right? The glyphosates and others, if you just don't eat wheat, or you are super careful about the sourcing. And we'll talk about a couple of better, quote unquote, better breads in a minute, because sometimes it's just nice to have a piece of bread, right? Especially if you're in Italy or in the Mediterranean, you want to have, their sourdough, which honestly, it's way different than our sourdough. They're not using the same flours. They're using ones that they physically have ground with the most basic processes, like just stone grinding. And they're starting with a different plant than we start with. They're not using that hybridized dwarf wheat that we use here in the US. And so many people can eat the breads from Italy, Spain. I just spent some time in Portugal because they start off with a totally different wheat that's not pulverized. It's not a dwarf wheat. It doesn't have the increased gliadin or gluten in there and the amylopectin A. So it's a much different type of wheat to begin with. But unfortunately, those are not highly available here in the US. But we'll talk about some of the breads that you could eat. And these are primarily those that are made of nuts and seeds that don't really have any wheat at all, especially not the super finely ground, highly processed ones. So maybe we should talk about that, because a lot of folks want to have a piece of avocado toast maybe. In my case, I love avocados, and once in a while an avocado toast is pretty awesome. And so I kind of got the idea to do this podcast because just over the weekend I was visiting my mom and at a place where I don't normally shop. And I just went to, just the corner regular grocery store, and I literally could not find any bread that met my expectation or qualification, if you would say it as such. I always look for something that will meet what I call the 5-ingredient rule, right? If it has more than 5 ingredients, I'm likely not going to pick it up. And if it has any ingredients that I'm not familiar with, I can't pronounce, or that are seed oils, for example, like sunflower, safflower, vegetable oil, canola oil. I don't care if these are organic. Any of these seed oils are not good. And most of them will have some version of canola, safflower, sunflower, soybean oil in them, almost all processed breads, including, I hate to say it, a lot of the ones that are advertised as the super healthy whole grain breads have these seed oils in them. Even a brand that I used to like years ago because I thought it was super healthy, that Dave's Killer Bread and things like that, they have soybean oil. And so you got to be careful. You got to read the ingredients, because remember, the oils that I just mentioned, the seed oils, are terrible. They cause so much inflammation. They cause all kinds of issues. We are out of balance with our omega-6s to omega-3s. We should have at least a 1-to-1 where we have plenty of omega-3 in our diet and much less omega-6. And we typically have 20-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. We're just eating way too many things with these polyunsaturated fats that often come from the seed oils, which are super, super inflammatory. The bottom line is they cause tons of inflammation. Inflammation is at the root of nearly all disease. But if you want more, check out the podcast on seed oils because I talk all about that. You got to be careful because almost all breads out there have some kind of seed oil in them. And so go for number 1, the 5-ingredient rule. Hopefully you can find 5 ingredients that you all recognize, none of which are seed oils. And if it does have wheat, hopefully ingredient number 1 is whole, the actual whole wheat. And if it is minimally processed, like just a stone ground whole wheat, there is a bread that I'm familiar with here when I'm visiting in Utah that I can get at Costco called Aspen Mills, which is a little bit better quality because it has whole ground wheat and doesn't have seed oils, doesn't have, I think it just uses honey as its source of sweetener and yeast and salt. I think there's like 4 or 5 ingredients. So if I do buy bread at all, I'll buy something like that. Or what I like even more than that is a sprouted grains bread. In fact, sprouting is really cool because it makes the ingredients more available. In fact, the sprouting it's kind of like the fermenting, right? You soak the grains in water for a period of time, they start to sprout, and so it makes the nutrients more available, and it also decreases the anti-nutrients, which will bind to the minerals and things that you want. And so it's a double goodness. It's not a double whammy, it's double goodness because it makes the nutrients more available by sprouting, and also it eliminates some of the anti-nutrients. And so when you sprout the grains, it is much more nutritious in the sense that the nutrients are much more available. So look for something that's sprouted. Look for something that has, if possible, no highly processed flours at all. You can use a grain and seed based bread instead. In fact, there's this company out there, it's called Lin's, that has a nice mix that you can just buy, and it literally just has 3 or 4 ingredients. You put there ground nuts and seeds, and you add a little vinegar, a super basic formula, I think some egg whites, and that's actually a really healthy way to do it. So you can check that out. It's called Lin's. It's available if you just Google it. It's one of the ones that you can trust out there that doesn't have the seed oils, and so really great option if you're going to eat bread. Like I said, I just don't eat a lot of bread, and when I do, I like to do sprouted grains. I will sometimes do sourdough if I can get a sourdough from an ancient starter, if you will, because that also, by nature, is fermented. When something is fermented, it basically has the ability to have the nutrients more available. Also, the fermentation process has positive probiotic bacteria in there, which can help with your gut health. So fermentation is awesome for that reason. It has probiotics, if you will. It also has less of this anti-nutrient called phytic acid, which is amazing. And so it also has a lower glycemic index in sourdough bread. So if I do reach for bread, it's typically a sourdough from starter. It's a sprouted grains, maybe this Ezekiel bread, which is out there, which is a sprouted grains type. That's what I reach for. There's another one that occasionally I've been able to find. It's a flaxseed bread, which is basically from the seeds. It's not ground flours. It's basically the flaxseed, and flaxseed has a lot of benefits. So that's another good one that I recommend. There's actually my dad. He lived in Germany for a while, and so he's a fan of this really dense. It's a type of rye bread, and it's like it's interesting because basically the way I look at it is any bread that's super soft, super fluffy, super aerated, that's usually the bread that's not good for you. The stuff that's really dense, like this German pumpernickel kind of rye bread, it's just made from crushed seeds and rye, and it's not highly pulverized. It's hard. Like it's literally, you can't just take a butter knife or whatever and slice through it. You almost have to have a special slicer to slice it up because it's super dense. My dad used to get that, and I actually thought it was kind of good. throw some butter on there, and I enjoyed it. So some of those types of breads can be healthier options. But if you want to avoid bread at all, that's okay too. Like, it's totally fine to avoid bread. Like, you can live without it, And what is that? We said initially that has been mentioned that bread is the staff of life. Well, we know that we can't live off bread alone anyway, right? So two of those ancient scriptures talk to us about bread. And what we need to remember is that the bread of today is not the bread that they were eating thousands of years ago, because of the dwarf wheat that we talked about that has been literally bred to be grown with pesticides. The nutrient value is much lower. It's highly pulverized, so it has extended glucose spiking abilities because of its highly pulverized form. So it's not awesome. And so if you want to eliminate it completely from your diet, I would recommend try 7 to 10 days where you don't eat any wheat or bread or gluten or anything like that. Try it for 7 to 10 days and see how much better you might feel. Maybe all your achy joints and pains will go away. Maybe your skin rashes will start to clear up. Maybe your headaches or brain fog or kind of gut issues with constipation or diarrhea or crampiness, maybe those will get better, because a lot of people don't even know it because they've never been tested, will have some form of gluten sensitivity. Even though they may not be full-on celiac, they may definitely have some sensitivities because, as I mentioned, the current day breads that are out there are mostly made from this dwarf wheat, which has a much higher percentage of the gluten and the gliadin protein and this amylopectin A, which is super, I don't want to say allergenic, but it's just very reactive, if you will, in the body and causing leaky gut. And leaky gut is not what you want. And you're not going to get a lot of nutrients from most bread anyway. It's super low in nutrients, right? That's why they have to so-called, fortify it, because most of the grains and flours out there today that are being harvested have very little nutritive value. So it's high in calories. It's kind of one of these that we could easily classify as being calorie rich, yet nutrient poor. So I would not recommend we make up a big part of our diet, despite what it says in the food pyramid that was designed in the 1990s, that literally has corresponded exactly with the rise in obesity and heart disease and everything else. We should not have breads as the primary calorie in our diet. In fact, if we eliminated them altogether, that would be fine. So something you might try, do a gluten-free diet for 7 to 10 days, see how you might feel, because I would bet that it may help you. And just remember, you won't be missing out, because most of these breads do not have much nutrients, if any significant nutrient value anyway. They are very calorically rich, nutrient poor, and they will just get you on this roller coaster, this so-called blood sugar roller coaster, where you spike up and then you drop down, and they actually make you crave and be more hungry and want more and more of it, because they are exactly that, nutrient poor. And so your body will want to seek out more calories to try to get the nutrients that it wants, and so you'll be hungrier. They won't satiate you. They're literally empty calories and super low in nutrients. So you could do just fine without them. And if you still want to include them in your diet, remember, reach for those that do not have the highly processed flours. Certainly those that don't have seed oils would be better. And look for sprouted grains, Ezekiel bread, for example, the super dense, rye pumpernickel bread that comes from Germany. And just make sure it has good ingredients, hopefully 5 or less. Like I said, if I buy bread, usually I buy it for the kids. I buy this Aspen Mills bread because it is ground wheat. It's not highly pulverized. It only has 5 ingredients or less. And I recognize all of them, right? And it has yeast from starter and that sort of thing. So look for simple ingredients, those you recognize. Look for fermented ones like sourdough from an original starter that are hopefully allowed to ferment at least overnight. 12 to 24 hours is best. And then the sprouted is better. It's magical in the sense that it makes the nutrients more available. It makes them also have less anti-nutrients to block off some of the absorption. So it's sort of a double goodness. You get more nutrients and less of the anti-nutrients. So I hope that's helpful for you. It's made a big difference in my life. I've literally cut out almost all of the breads and grains. I occasionally will have a piece of avocado toast. I love avocado, and I love to put it on almost anything. And when I do, I search out for those sprouted grains bread, the whole grains, and actually the seed-based breads are amazing. As I mentioned, there's a couple available. They even have mixes that you can buy, like the Lin's bread mixes out there. You guys should try that. That's amazing. And just look for those that have ingredients that you recognize, 5 or less, and they don't use the seed oils. Please, 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 no seed oils, no safflower, sunflower, soybean, canola, rice bran oil. All these highly processed vegetable canola oils are not awesome. We've talked about that ad nauseum. But yeah, there's a way to do it. Try to eliminate it. You could do without. You're not going to miss any nutrient value. Eat whole food, real food that you can grow or get fresh grown is the best, not the highly processed pulverized ones. It won't spike your blood sugar, and it will be much more nutritious and healthier for you. So follow me at Modern Medicine Movement or at Dr. Thomas Hemingway. Please sign up for my Thrive community. I can't wait to see you there. It's an amazing place to be supported, to get lots of information. Join me live. Join me in the chats. I can't wait to see you. The Thrive community, it's in the bio. Aloha. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out.